thank you indeed, everyone, for joining us. My name is Richard Pater. I'm the director of BICOM. Alongside me is Kira Lewis, who is our communications associate and will be helping with me when it comes to the time of Q&A. Welcome to the latest BICOM event as we celebrate 10 years of Fathom Journal. BICOM, as I'm sure people know, is the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre. Our mandate is to create better understanding of Israel within the UK. We do this by a number of methods, but primarily by publishing regular briefings and analysis, engaging with the UK media, arranging private meetings and connecting them to Israeli experts and bringing them on delegations to Israel. About 10 years ago, and Alan will expand on this, we recognized a gap in the market and created Fathom Journal to give a platform for longer form analysis and to expose a broad range of thoughts and opinions about Israel and from Israel. Before I introduce my colleague, Professor Alan Johnson, I'd just like to thank Einat personally. From your time when you first became a member of Knesset, and since then, you've been a really loyal and valuable friend of BICOM, regularly making yourself available to our audiences. And so on a personal level, thank you very much indeed for what you've done in the past and what you continue to do for us. Just on a couple of logistics points, as I said, we're going to start with a presentation, and then at the end there'll be an opportunity for people to ask questions. I encourage people, whoever wants to ask a question, please write it in the box which says Q&A, and we will get to as many of them as possible. Before I hand over to Alan, I would also just like to thank Professor Alan Johnson personally as well as being a colleague for the last more than 10 years. It's really his vision and drive and leadership that has created Fathom that we have today. And I think on behalf of myself, the organization and our board, we just wanted to salute you and thank you for your leadership and vision and for bringing us to where we are today. So on that note, I will hand over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Richard. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. It's a busy time of year for everyone, I know. I've been asked to say a few words as editor about Fathom at 10, and then I have the pleasure of introducing Einat. So I'll speak for about 10, 12 minutes or so before I introduce Einat, if that's okay. So why was Fathom created? How's the first decade gone, and who do we have to thank? Fathom was created by BICOM in 2012 for the long haul. We were created not to chase the daily news cycle, but to help realign opinion about Israel, particularly among the mostly liberal, mostly skeptical opinion formers and decision makers found in Western universities, think tanks, politics, media, and civil society, the tastemakers, so to speak. We aim to make a balanced and expert case, not for every policy and every politician in Israel, but really against some things. We wanted to be an alternative to those demonizing conceptual frameworks which were on offer for understanding Israel, the false historical narratives which were distorting people's understanding of the conflict, and really the quite hate-filled sensibilities, you know, those structures of feeling and response that people were developing towards Israel, which were becoming increasingly prevalent in parts of Western intellectual culture, especially in civil society and, sadly, on the left. We thought that those frameworks, those concepts and those sensibilities were acting as a kind of wall between people and seeing Israel plain, developing a more reasonable, a more real world understanding of both the country and the conflict. And we were created really to knock that wall down, or at least to contribute to knocking it down. Our hope was that we could do so best if we refused simplicities, refused to paint Israel as perfect, tried to have a bandwidth which was able to take in left and right, Israeli and Palestinian, critique and defense. We thought if we did so, we could showcase to our audiences a better way to think and talk about Israel, a better kind of conversation about the country and the conflict than one that was being offered on the placards. We thought it should be marked by openness to complexity, to historical context, to some political balance, and to, again, this word real world understanding of, for instance, how to renew the peace process and how not to try to do so. We had a wager, really, that we could marry two things together. One was a principled and values-based approach to ends, where we wanted to get to, and we thought it was possible to marry that to a real world and prudential approach to means, how you said about getting there. So that was the idea of Fathom. How's the first decade gone? Not perfect, but I think pretty well. We launched with a bang in 2012. It's ridiculously ambitious now, I think back to it. We launched with no less than 3 platforms for the journal. We launched at the same time a new website, a new app created from scratch, and a glossy print edition. So this is one of the print editions. This was issue 2, with yellow pin on the front. It's an absolutely beautiful object, incredibly hard to produce every 3 months with a staff of about 2, and incredibly expensive as well, actually. But to our rescue, we realized that in an internet age, everybody just goes to websites anyway. So we were spending all the money on the app and the hard copy, and all of our audience was at the website. So pretty soon we folded those 2, and we just have a website now. We began to understand how the internet age works as we went along. So we went from an old school quarterly magazine to something much more frequent, which is at the pace of the new communications technology. And we developed an e-list. It's got about 9,000 names on it now, mostly opinion formers, and they receive Fathom content every Tuesday morning. If you want to be on that list, just go to the website, you'll find a pop-up and you can join there. So technology being as it is, we know that we are reaching 2 kinds of audience. One is, and they're both hugely important to us, one is a general, intelligent, Israel interested readership. And the second is the opinion formers and decision makers we were created to reach, which is great. What can I say about the content? It's Israel in HD, it's 360 degrees, it's politics, it's economics, it's culture, it's history, it's theory, it's film, it's literature, and more. We've published about 1,000 articles and interesting series like My Israeli Music, where you can, and nowhere else can you find Keith Khan Harris's top 10 Israeli death metal tracks, 3 best books, rereadings, and more. The content's been read 2 million times by about 500,000 unique users in over 150 nations. I think it's been written often by the world's best analysts, academics, public intellectuals, and activists. And any journal stands or falls by that, the quality of the, so to speak, stable of writers that you can attract and hold, and the degree to which you can persuade them to give you their best work. Fathom ebooks are soon appearing, and the one that I'm most proud of is titled Rescuing Israeli-Palestinian Peace, the Fathom Essays 2016 to 2020. It clocks in at no less than 464 pages. It has 54 contributors. And in my view, it is one of, if not the best single source on expert and creative thinking about the peace process and its renewal today. So we're immensely proud of that. All free at the website, by the way. But there was always more to Fathom than simply creating a website and content to go on it. The idea was always that we functioned as an intellectual hub. That simply means that you pulse out influence continually along as many channels as you can, in as many formats as you can, to as many audiences as you can, on as many platforms as you can. So to the extent that we're able, we have done these kinds of things. We've organized breakfast Fathom forums with expert speakers and an invited audience in London. We've forged new partnerships to create publications and events and conferences with think tanks like RUSI and Chatham House, in Israel with INSS, the Fabian Society in this country, the Anti-Defamation League, and with the Jewish press in this country, the Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle. As our reputation grew, Fathom staff were being invited to talk and think about this new way of talking about Israel on other people's platforms, which was great. That was the idea. So we were able to put the case on BBC Newsnight, BBC Panorama, Al Jazeera, Sky News, The Guardian, Haaretz, the Times of Israel, the New Statesman, Prospect, the Telegraph, and so on. We were invited to, and we spoke at a lot of university campuses. So I got to debate with Ian Pape a number of times. I even got to debate with Norman Finkelstein twice. He called me a stupid goy, and I demand a special place in heaven for having to go through those nights when this is all over. I undertook speaking tours of Australia, New Zealand. We addressed the European Parliament and the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in Westminster. We did decide pretty early in the life of the journal we needed to take on an additional focus, which was the growing danger of the new anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Now, it wasn't the case that we did this in 2015 when Jeremy Corbyn took over the Labour Party. This pamphlet we produced in summer of 2013, The Oldest Prejudice in Modern Garb. But certainly from 2015, we commissioned a steady stream of expert analysis, and around 30 of those essays, which appeared in Fathom, are being collected and published in 2023 by Routledge Press, which I'm hugely proud of because it speaks to the quality of what is in the journal. And I'm working on that collection now. It's going to be called Mapping Left Anti-Semitism. I do think that our output on that issue did help to rally the response in the UK to the Labour Party's crisis. And along with many others, we provided those on the front line with the intellectual ammunition they needed to win the day. For example, we produced a Fathom report. It was 30,000 words long, 300 footnotes. It was called Institutionally Anti-Semitic, and it was cited by the statutory body, the Equality and Human Rights Council, which investigated the Labour Party. Briefly, who do we have to thank? And I am not going to do a Sally Fields Oscar list here, so you can relax, but I absolutely have to thank a couple of people. Firstly, the whole BICOM board, who in 2012 backed a pretty radical idea on a piece of paper from an academic that they didn't know that well. So that was bold of them. And I hope I've repaid that confidence. To all the colleagues over the decade, but a special shout out to Dermot Kehoe, who was then CEO of BICOM, and he green-lighted the project and supported me so well in the early years. The current chairs, the current board, and the CEO, Richard Pader, have been unstinting in their support for the journal. I'd like to thank the advisory editors, which Einat is one, always available to read a submission, suggest a writer, or tell us when we've got something wrong. I've been blessed as an editor to have three brilliant editorial colleagues. So I want to thank Toby Green, Lauren Bell-Cross, Caliph Ben-Dor, and Sam Nerding. All our interns have been stellar, but there's too many to mention here. So, and a final thank you to the most important people of all, our donors. Without you, we wouldn't exist. It's really that simple. So thank you to each and every one of you. So that's Fathom. Pretty good start. I've been absolutely bowled over by the birthday greetings we've been receiving from colleagues and writers and others around the world, and we're going to let people see some of them on our site soon. It's really heartwarming to hear what they've had to say. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the night, Einat Wilf. Dr. Wilf was born and raised in Israel in a Labour Zionist family. She served as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces. A Cambridge and Harvard graduate, she served as a foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and she was an MK from 2010 to 2013 for the Labour Party and then for the Independence Party. To do a quick loop, the Independence Party at the time was led by Ehud Barak. It was Ehud Barak who launched Fathom in 2012 at the BICOM annual dinner. She's a prolific writer and analyst. Her books include Winning the War of Words, Essays on Zionism in Israel. With her colleague Adi Schwartz, The War of Return, which was praised by the New York Times as convincing and essential. And touching on what we're going to be hearing about tonight, We Should All Be Zionists, Essays on Zionism, the Middle East, and the Path to Peace. That's the CV, though. What I want to say as Fathom editor is that Einat's been a friend of the journal and one of the best friends of the journal, and from the start. She was a founding member of the advisory editorial board. She's written, I think, 7 wonderful pieces for the journal. And she's been a friend to BICOM too, speaking at our events in London and speaking to our delegations who we've taken to Israel. One of the reasons I was so pleased when Einat said yes to be the speaker at the first Fathom annual lecture was something Maddie Friedman said about Einat when he reviewed one of her essay collections in Fathom. And Maddie wrote this: to defame a country is easy. To defend Israel requires an understanding of at least 100 years of history in both Europe and the Middle East, of how we reached this moment, of what Israel's choices really are right now. And the person needs to be worldly enough to make sense to people outside the bubble of those who are reflexively sympathetic to Israel anyway. And it helps not to be ideologically rigid or so angry that you can't speak calmly. He went on to say, not many people can do that, but one of the most skillful is Einat Wilf, and she seems tough enough to keep it up. So, for many reasons, I'm absolutely delighted to invite Einat to give the first annual Fathom Lecture on the subject, why it is that if you want peace, you should be a Zionist. I think Einat's going to speak for around 30, 35 minutes, but we're all very cool if she speaks for longer. And I think Richard has said there's plenty of time for Q&A, and he's advised you how you can put your questions. So without further ado, I'm delighted to invite Einat to give the inaugural Fathom annual lecture. Thank you, Einat.
Thank you so much, Alan. And really, it's an honor that you asked me to do this. I'm honored to be able to do this. Alan, yes, your place in heaven is absolutely secure and assured for everything that you have done. And really, it's been an honor to work with Fathom and with BICOM, Richard, over the years. I'm particularly proud of the essays that I've written for Fathom over the years. I still use them. I still refer to them. I still refer to a lot of other essays by many other colleagues. So you've been a wonderful resource and really fulfilling an important and valuable mission. So when I named my most recent collection of essays, We Should All Be Zionists, it was, of course, a bit of a cheeky referral to the book, We Should All Be Feminists. It was intended to be a bit provocative, but it is actually genuine. The essays in the book describe my thinking as to why I realized that for the cause of peace, we should actually strive to have as many people become Zionists as possible, globally and especially in the region. And for that, I want to say a few words about why this is necessary for the cause of peace, and then how it might actually come about. So in order to understand why the adoption of Zionism is necessary for the attainment of peace, we need to understand what the conflict is really about. As Alan mentioned, I come from the Israeli left, the Israeli Labor Party. This is the environment that I grew up in. And like Israelis of the Labor Party in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up and a young adult, the main message of the party at the time, and it was a compelling message, was that Israel has a path to peace. And the path to peace is actually quite simple. All that Israel has to do in order to attain peace is exchange land in exchange for peace. Now, a few words back, why does Israel even need a path to peace? The reason, of course, is that when Israel is established in 1948, and when the battles are over by 1949, none of Israel's Arab neighbors are willing to sign a peace agreement with it. The only thing that Israel's neighbors are willing to sign with it are ceasefire agreements. So when people, for example, talk about the pre-1967 borders, they're not borders. Borders require both sides to agree. Those were only ceasefire lines because from the Arab perspective, even though the immediate battles were over, the ongoing war, which was waged against the very existence of a Jewish state in any borders, that war was still not over. And therefore, the most they were willing to acknowledge is that they are now in a ceasefire with an entity that, as far as they were concerned, was still illegitimate and should not exist, And in due course, the war will be renewed, and hopefully the goal from their perspective of no Jewish state would be achieved. Indeed, the war is renewed in the most spectacular way in 1967, and the Arab armies do even worse than in 1948, and they lose the substantial territory of the Sinai Peninsula in the south, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights in the north from Syria, and the West Bank from Jordan. So now Israel has tripled in size. It has all these territorial assets. And the idea emerges that Israel can now exchange this land, which hopefully the Arab neighbors understand they can no longer defeat Israel by force. And hopefully they'll understand that they need to make peace with Israel, and Israel can exchange land in return for peace. So this was a very compelling idea. Political ideas are simple. When they're simple, they're compelling, and especially with the vision of peace. So land for peace was a compelling idea, and for a while it really seemed to work. This was the basis for the peace agreement with Egypt, the entire Sinai Peninsula in exchange for a peace agreement with Egypt, which we can discuss, and we will discuss whether it's an actual peace agreement, but officially it is in exchange for land. Later, there was a peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan gave up its territorial claim to the West Bank. And really, the 1990s were the heyday of the land for peace. Israelis from the peace camp elected 2 prime ministers, Rabin and later Barak, on a land for peace agenda. The peace agreement with Jordan is signed with Rabin. Barak negotiates with Syria over the future of the Golan Heights. And of course, the highlight of the land for peace and the 90s is the negotiations with the Palestinians, with the Palestine Liberation Organization over the West Bank and Gaza. Like many Israelis, I was euphoric during the 90s, like many Israelis of the left. I really believe, just like, everything in the world was happening, the Soviet Union was gone, and the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and apartheid in South Africa came to an end, and we were going to make peace in our corner of the region. And when Ehud Barak goes to Camp David, like many Israelis of the peace camp, I'm euphoric. He is finally going to put the land for peace formula to the test. And he puts on the table the following proposal. A Palestinian state, ending the occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, addressing all the issues that we were told were part of the land for peace formula and that will bring peace. And all the Palestinians had to do was say yes. And what do? They walk away. Arafat walks away in 2000. Abu Mazen walks away in 2008. And not only do they walk away, they're not criticized by their people for walking away, meaning that by walking away, they're actually fulfilling what their people wanted. And what follows, of course, is also a terrible wave of violence and massacres in our streets. So like many Israelis, I began to ask, what's going on? Why aren't we having peace? What do the Palestinians want that we could give them that would bring peace? And what I realized, and ultimately my colleague Adi Schwartz, and that became the book, The War of Return, was that the answer was staring us in the face. To the Palestinians' credit, they have told us all the time what they wanted. We just didn't listen, or when we did listen, we didn't take them seriously. They told us from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, no Jewish state in any borders. They were very clear, they were very consistent. That's what the demand for the so-called right of return meant. They've been very consistent for a century, actually. We just didn't listen or didn't take them seriously. And as we were going through this process, Adi and myself, to understand what the Palestinians wanted, in the research, I came across this remarkable quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. As I'm sure you know, he was no friend to Zionism or to the Jewish people. This is the foreign minister of the Exodus. And in February of 1947, he needs to explain to the people of Britain why Britain is basically betraying the mandate that it received from the League of Nations and throwing it back at the United Nations, the air. And he says the following: His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable. This is February 1947. There's no settlements, no occupation, no Nakba, no refugees. And already in February of 1947, an outside observer says this conflict is irreconcilable. Why? He says, look, there's two peoples in the land, Jews and Arabs. So there's no question about who are the two sides. It's not religion, it's two peoples, two nations, two collectives, Jews and Arabs. And he goes on to say, for each of these, they have one top priority. He calls it the point of principle. So each one of these collectives is organized around a single top priority. He says, for the Jews, the top priority is a state. The Jews want a state. He says, for the Arabs, the top priority is for the Jews not to have a state. Consider this definition of the conflict. He's not saying, look, there's two groups who want independence. The Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state, and we're not really sure where to draw the border. No, he says, as a matter of an absolute top priority around which the entire people are organized, the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. This is by definition irreconcilable. Sometimes I therefore define the conflict in one sentence. This is a conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism. That's it. People might say that the conflict is complicated. The essence of the conflict is very simple. Jewish Zionism versus Arab anti-Zionism. The details might be complicated. Who did what in what year may be complicated. The essence of the conflict is remarkably simple. Notice, by the way, that in saying that this is the conflict, I'm not necessarily making a judgment. One might believe that Arab anti-Zionism is a completely legitimate, moral, and justified worldview. That doesn't change the fact that this is the conflict. Sometimes when I discuss this and define the conflict, and let's say I do it on social media, from the Arab or Palestinian side, people will say, of course, you're apartheid, settler, colonialists, European, you stole our land. So they'll dig into it, but no one will ever undermine the premise. No one will say, what are you talking about? Of course that we support the right of the Jewish people to have a state and part of the land. The only thing we oppose are the settlements. No one on the Palestinian side ever says that. They only dig deeper into justifying the anti-Zionism, arguing that it's the moral and justified position, but they're not saying that it's not their position. So this is the conflict. The conflict for the last century has been a conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism. If this is the conflict, and it is indeed irreconcilable, then how does it end? How do we get to peace? And we get to peace actually quite simply. One of the sides has to give up on their top priority. Either the Jews forgo Zionism, and a lot of people are mobilized to achieve that goal, or the Arabs give up on their anti-Zionism, which obviously is my preferred vision for peace. But that's it. There's actually no other way to peace. All the details that people discuss, one state or things of the sort, they're merely details of the question of who gives up their top priority. So when people say the Palestinians now want a one-state solution, they've actually always wanted it. The implicit claim that at one point they were willing to have a two-state solution, as in a Jewish state and an Arab state, and because of Israeli actions such as settlement building, have now resigned themselves to a one-state solution, that's completely wrong. That has always been their goal, because a one-state solution is merely another way of saying no Jewish state in any borders. The Jews do not have a state. So basically, this is the conflict. And sometimes I half jokingly that we are basically engaged in a battle of mutual exhaustion, meaning we are trying, each side is trying to exhaust the other side to give up on their top priority. The Arab side mobilizing the non-aligned movement, the Soviet Union at the time, now as many people as they can in the West, on the left, are trying to mobilize as many people to the cause of anti-Zionism and to the cause of trying to get Jews to give up on their Zionism, either by wars, terrorism, international condemnations, legal warfare, anything that would lead the Jews to say, you know what, just not worth it. It's not worth it. We're out of here. Or we're trying to exhaust the Arab side to giving up on their anti-Zionism, to recognizing that we're going nowhere, that the existence of Israel is not an aberration in the history of an Arab and Islamic Middle East, that we're not foreigners, that we actually belong here. That's what we're trying to exhaust the other side to achieve. Now, why are we still stuck and why does the conflict continue? Because both sides believe they're winning. The Arab side sees enough indications that lead them to say, we're on the right track. Another generation, another 5 generations, this Zionist experiment in the region is not going to last. Arabs or Muslims are the overwhelming majority. The Jews are a small minority. This is not going to hold. At the end of the day, and we're seeing enough signs that they're being tired and they're losing the support of American Jews and they're losing the support of the Western left. And we just need to be patient, but we're winning. And Israelis also think they're winning. Part of it is the peace agreements. Part of it is clearly that the Arab world has lost its taste for mobilizing armies against Israel. Terrorism is at bay. Israel enjoys more diplomatic relations than any time in its history. And of course, the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords really point the path to what it might look like when the Arab world decides to forgo anti-Zionism. When the Abraham Accords were signed, it seemed as if there was almost a concerted effort to downplay them. People said things like, those countries were never at war with Israel, so it doesn't matter that they're normalizing relations with Israel. It's not really peace. They don't share a border. They're unimportant countries. They're at the margins of the Arab world. This is just a bribe. It's about Iran. They're just getting airplanes. I'm sure a lot of people were not happy that this was a Trump and Netanyahu foreign policy achievement, so maybe that played into the desire to downplay it. But it seemed as if too many people who supposedly were people who cared about peace were not enthusiastic about the Abraham Accords. And this for me was odd because it was clear that the Abraham Accords were different and transformational. Why? Because for decades, Israelis were told that the peace that we have with Egypt and Jordan is the ceiling. This is the best we can hope for. As long as we don't have peace with the Palestinians, what we have with Egypt and Jordan will be the most that any Arab country will ever do with Israel. And just to understand what that means, Egypt signed a peace agreement with Israel, but barely any diplomatic relations, no cultural relations, no economic relations, no tourism. Egypt continues to be one of the top producers and promoters of anti-Semitic content in Arabic. Together with Jordan, they're at the top of promoting anti-Israel resolutions in international bodies. I remember as a member of Knesset, I attended a conference in Jordan. The feeling was that I am in a deeply hostile country. And again, we were told that this is peace. As long as we don't make peace with the Palestinians, that's the ceiling with any Arab country. But we can't make peace with the Palestinians because the Palestinians are still committed to anti-Zionism, to no Jewish state from the river to the sea. So we're stuck. What's going to happen? And then the Abraham Accords happen. And the Abraham Accords just break through that. The countries of the Abraham Accords, especially the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, unlike Egypt and Jordan, basically go all in. Every day, new agreements are signed in agriculture and culture and space and sciences, and there's tourism, and extensive diplomatic and people-to-people relations. And I have to share with you, for example, seeing Emirates land in Ben Gurion Airport, that's huge. You know, as Israelis for years, Emirates was this Shangri-La, you know, this airline with a mythical first class, and we would never board it because we're Israelis. To the psychological effect of seeing Emirates land in Ben Gurion, to see the flights, the departures and arrivals kind of board in Ben Gurion Airport, full of direct flights for Dubai of different airlines, the psychological impact, the sense of the lifting of the siege is huge. I mean, nothing that could be kind of made into unimportant. It's hugely important. So there were a lot of people-to-people kind of coming together after the Abraham Accords. I became part of those groups. And through that, I got to know two Emiratis, a young man and a woman. And together we wrote an op-ed. And the op-ed opens as follows. We are proud Arabs, we are proud Muslims, and we're Zionists. They did not run away from this identification and from this word. And they basically went on to write in this op-ed that they see no contradiction between a proud Arab and a proud Muslim identity and supporting the Jewish right to self-determination. The amazing thing was that the thing that was most important for them to put in the piece, in the op-ed, was to highlight that the anti-Zionism of the Arab world was a complete waste of time. So they were basically waking up from decades of Arab anti-Zionism to say, what have we to show for it? How has that been good for the Arab world? And they basically were able to show that we can begin to imagine the rise of something that I've come to call Islamic and Arab Zionism. Basically, the idea that the Jewish right to self-determination can be compatible and even rooted in a proud Arab and Islamic identity. Now, why is that necessary, of course, for peace? Because if you accept my analysis of the conflict as a conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism, then the possibility of Arab Zionism basically points the path to peace. And the brilliance of the Abraham Accords, of course, is the name. Now, I'm under no illusion. Ever since the Abraham Accords, I've been able to give more optimistic talks. You know, when I only was after the book of the War of Return, a lot of people were despondent because the book basically said, look, this is what the conflict is about, Jewish Zionism versus Arab anti-Zionism. And a lot of people were despondent by the possibility that this is so irreconcilable and that only by one side giving up their top priority can we get to peace. And the possibility that the Arab world will forgo anti-Zionism just didn't compute, didn't seem like a real possibility. Now, I'm under no illusion. The majority in the Arab world are still of the view that Israel is a white settler, European, colonial, foreign implant in a land to which they have no connection, no rights, and do not belong. And because they're foreign, they are also by definition temporary. And that means that the only way to deal with Israel is through resistance and patience until they go, until like the Crusader state and the French in Algeria, and most recently Abu Mazen spoke about the Americans in Afghanistan. Like all foreign implants, we will go. And therefore, there's no need to compromise with us because we're temporary and we're foreign and we'll go. So that's still the dominant narrative in the Arab world. I'm under no illusion. But for the first time ever since the birth of Zionism, and especially since the establishment of the State of Israel, we have an Arab worldview that is confident, that exists, and that speaks up for itself. And the amazing thing about the Abraham Accords is that we're actually not the central story here. I sometimes call the Abraham Accords collateral benefit. were actually the outcome of the desire of several Arab countries and Arab leaders to formulate an Arab and Islamic identity and vision that are associated with success and tolerance and moderation, especially against the appeal of fundamentalism, ISIS, and so forth. And just normalization with Israel has become part of the package. Now, the interesting thing about the Abraham Accords, and that also explains something about Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, is as soon as they became pro-Israel and pro-Zionist, they also became pro-Jewish. So as you can imagine, there's not a lot of Jews in Bahrain and the UAE or in Morocco. But as soon as these countries signed the Abraham Accords, they took whatever Jews existed there, some of them just expats, and suddenly they started celebrating with them Jewish holidays and Jewish weddings. And again, my Twitter feed is full of invitations for lighting Hanukkah candles in Dubai or anything of the sort. So for quite a few years, I've been part of debates on whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And at one point, I realized there's actually no use debating the theoretical claim, because you could always point to Satmar Jews and say, okay, anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitism. So I decided to abandon the theoretical case and just settle for the practical case. And just to make the case that no matter what the protestations are, that it's not about Jews, any society, country, political party, organization that had decided to make anti-Zionism a central organizing principle, within a short time became hostile to Jewish life, and after a short while basically had no Jews, and over time had nothing to show for it. So of course the Arab world is a classic example. As soon as the Arab world organized itself around anti-Zionism, that was pretty much the Arab League, within a short while it became a very hostile place for the Jewish communities, and those are Jewish communities, as I'm sure you know, that predated the world of the Arab and Islamic conquests. And within a few short years, there were no Jews. And 7 decades later, what has Arab anti-Zionism done for the Arab world? What do they have to show for it? And it's no coincidence that the most successful Arab countries are the ones to emerge first from anti-Zionism, to basically say, we're heading towards a bright future of success, and we just don't have any use for this anti-Zionist ideology. The Soviet Union is another case in point, the original, basically, drafters of anti-Zionism. Basically, the Soviet Union after World War II, they can't be anti-Semites, right? They just defeated the Nazis. They're just anti-Zionists. But the Jews in the Soviet Union knew exactly what that meant. As soon as they could leave, they left. And again, how has the Soviet Union benefited from decades of anti-Zionism? Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. I don't know enough about their policies, but I'm sure they had great policies that could have benefited the people of Britain. But they were so obsessed with anti-Zionism that it led to, first of all, it created a hostile environment for Jews in the party, but ultimately it led to the collapse of the party. So again, what good has it done? And you can see the same with the Women's March in the United States, with American campuses. Anti-Zionism, there's no arc in which anti-Zionism somehow turns out well for the Jews, or somehow has a benefit to the anti-Zionists over time. And the beauty of the Abraham Accords is that they were able to show the opposite, is that when you turn pro-Zionist and pro-Israel, you actually also create an environment that embraces Jewish life. So it works together. Whatever the theory is, it actually works together. So this is why I think we should all be Zionists. We should all be Zionists because the more that Zionism becomes an Arab and Muslim position, and the more that Arabs and Muslims look at Israel and say Abraham, the quicker we're likely to get to peace. And the more that countries are Zionist, the more those are countries that will be hospitable to Jewish life, because again, there's just no arc in which anti-Zionist environments are hospitable to Jewish life. So whether you care about Jewish life outside of Israel, or whether you care about having peace between Israel and Arab countries, and ultimately between Israelis and Palestinians, having everyone be a Zionist is actually the best way to achieve both peace and a thriving Jewish future. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Einat, and thank you for battling through. We're wishing you feeling better now. So yeah, drink some water and rest for a moment. We've got quite a few questions coming through, which we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. But I'll hand over to my colleague Kira, who will take you through those questions. I suggest we do one at a time and see how we go.
Hi, thank you. So the first one is whether you care to comment on the recent news story that Saudi Arabia is predicating a diplomatic agreement with Israel on 3 asks from the US. So also if you could comment more widely on Saudi Arabia and what you see the future relations with Israel, what they might be there.
So there's no doubt that in the whole kind of vision of the Abraham Accords and peace in the region, Saudi is the big prize. Because Saudi can speak, first of all, to the Arab identity, right? Saudi Arabia, this is the origin of the Arab conquests and the Arab Middle East, and it can speak to Islam as the guardian of the 2 holiest places. So there's no doubt that it's the big prize. And if Saudi normalizes relations with Israel, then we can officially declare the Israeli-Arab conflict over. A lot of people already kind of say it's over, but then we really could officially say it's over, and it will turn countries like Algeria or Syria into the laggards. So those who will kind of insist on not normalizing, it will be kind of a tipping point where those who resist normalizing with Israel will be increasingly perceived as the laggards. Now, Saudi knows that. And because it knows that, it has asks. And the asks that Saudi has are actually mostly from the United States, not from Israel. And here is where I express my disappointment with the current administration. They don't seem, I mean, to begin with, their whole attitude to the Abraham Accords was very standoffish, which I thought was wrong. For about a year, they would even refuse to call it the Abraham Accords, which was, I thought, a bit juvenile. I mean, just because this was like the Trump thing, they're not, I mean, I don't think this is how a serious world power behaves. And even when they were willing to begin to embrace them, the feeling was that they're doing it in a way that's really not from the kishkes, that they don't really believe in that, and that they're still stuck in the notion that it has to be all about the Palestinians. And as a result, they're not willing to kind of put their weight on kind of their thumb on the weights to make it happen. And I think it's a shame, because this is an easy, not an easy, I mean, you have to work for it, but this is a foreign policy win waiting to happen. And it's been known for a while that Saudi is willing, but it knows what it's worth. It has asks. The smaller ones are from Israel, but the bigger ones are from the United States. And I do sincerely hope that at one point the United States will understand that it would be good for so many reasons to actually pursue that and have that foreign policy win.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question that is on a similar note. So how does the anti-Zionist behavior of World Cup fans relate to your thesis, as much as Israelis were permitted to attend on the World Cup?
So Qatar is still so as I began to say, in the Arab world, as I said, I'm under no illusion. The dominant narrative is still that Israel is the white settler, European foreign colonialist that stole a land to which it has no connection. Qatar is one of the main countries that promotes this idea through Al Jazeera, through its support for Hamas. So Qatar is very much on the other side of it. It wants legitimacy. It wanted to host FIFA, the World Cup. The condition was to allow everyone who wants to attend, including Israelis, to come in. So they had to do that, but they're not doing it happily. And they made it very clear that as much as they were forced to allow Israelis in, they're not happy to allow Israelis in. So Qatar is definitely a country that made it very clear also to its visitors that mistreating Israelis would not be frowned upon, shall we say. Whereas in a place like the UAE or Bahrain or even Morocco, today it's very clear that any notion of mistreating Israelis is frowned upon heavily. And the message comes across loud and clear. So again, the dominant narrative in the Arab world is still the classic one of Israelis being complete illegitimate presence in the region. But at least for the first time, we can feel, we can taste, we can see what it looks like when Arab countries adopt a different attitude, something that we didn't have with Egypt and Jordan. And what's interesting is that it's beginning to have a small effect also on Egypt and Jordan. Egypt, for example, renewed the direct flights from Sharm to Tel Aviv. Jordan signed recently an agreement with Israel on water and electricity mediated by the UAE. I think a couple of weeks ago, I came back from Spain. The War of Return just came out in Spanish. As I landed, one side of the airport, so one side of my airplane was Emirates, the other side of my airplane was parked Egypt Air. And I thought, this is the stuff of dreams. So we have a lot of things that are showing change, but we should not be under any illusion that this is the majority. Hopefully one day.
Thank you. So another question saying that Fathom has a valuable and nuanced message about Israel. How willing do you think the media and the liberal left are to listen? So they've given some examples of Channel 4's recent Unreported World programme on Gaza, which was depressingly anti-Israel, and the BBC has published things that are as bad. How do you think it's best to address this?
So I have a colleague who says at the end of the day, it's not a matter of demand. It's not a matter of supply, it's a matter of demand. So for example, Fathom supplies a beautiful product. It's smart, it's intelligent, it's researched, it's a beautiful product. The problem is that the market demand is in a very different place. There is a constant, sadly ancient, demand in the market for stories that portray Jews as bloodthirsty, evil. I mean, there's just a demand for that. It's a comforting story. It's a story that sits at the basis of so much of at least some elements of Western civilization. And I sometimes say that adults are not different from children in the sense that we also we get comfort from hearing stories repeated. So to have this ancient story about the evil, bloodthirsty Jews be repeated again and again, there's a comfort to it. And there's a market demand. Alan mentioned Mati Friedman, who writes beautifully about the real Israel. I think this is really his life's work to convey actual Israel to people. So Mati Friedman, his first big breakthrough piece was about the fact that as someone working for AP, a lot of the pieces that he wanted to write would not get through the editors because that's not what they wanted. So at the end of the day, the market wants a very different story. So there's much more demand for certain stories that repeat comfortable ideas about Jews. And we need to continue, and we're all here dedicated to continuing to tell the real story, the different story. But you know, sometimes when I come back from yet another frustrating meeting with a European diplomat, I call Adi Schwartz, my co-writer for The War of Return. And, we're almost like each other's support group. And one time he told me, look, Einat, under the best circumstances, we're fighting against 7-10 decades of accumulated lies. He says, under the worst circumstances, we're fighting against millennia of accumulated libels. So yeah, that's the market that we're operating on, and it's very deep.
Thank you. The next one is, what role do you think the diminished role of oil has in this?
There's no doubt that a lot of the geopolitics are driving the Abraham Accords. So the diminished role of oil, the fact especially that the United States is producing oil and exporting oil, this is what has led to the fact that the United States, shall we say, is maybe not leaving completely the Middle East, but certainly reducing its footprint. And this has been a consistent policy from Obama to Trump to Biden. Now, this is not going unnoticed. I remember when President Obama declared that he's pivoting to Asia. I remember thinking, okay, we can't pivot to Asia. As long as we Jews have a connection to this land, and this is where we insist on realizing our self-determination, we're kind of stuck here. So our neighbors too began to realize that we're here, we're not pivoting anywhere. So that came as part of also the ongoing exhaustion, the understanding that Israel is going nowhere, that Israel is becoming stronger and stronger, that the United States, because of oil, is reducing its footprint. In parallel, the leaders of the Gulf, their understanding also that at one point oil can no longer be the entire story of their economies, they started to have a vision for a different economy that's based more on finance and tourism and space exploration and real visions for a successful, diverse country and economy, emphasis on education, on higher education. So it's coming from several directions, and all of these directions ended up coalescing around the idea that actually Israel is here to stay. Israel in many ways can be perhaps even more dependable than the United States, which is reducing its footprint. Because oil is no longer the only determinant, there's more places for cooperation with Israel on science and technology and water and agriculture. So all of these things came together to make normalization something that the countries themselves wanted. And this is why it's not just about Iran. Everyone talks about that, that's important, but it's not just about Iran. It's not just about weapons. All of these are important, but it's about a much bigger transformation that is happening all across the Middle East, and where normalization with Israel is actually being shaped as an attractive option in this new Middle East.
Thank you. The next question is, one of the main criticisms of the Abraham Accords is that they are essentially with the regimes and not the people. Considering these regimes use Palestine as a crutch for so long, will their populations catch up with the new position on Israel?
So it's a combination. First of all, I have to say, at what point I kind of said that my heart goes out to the Abraham Accords countries. Until they normalize relations with Israel, nobody cared about whether they were democracies, what was their human rights record. But as soon as they signed the normalization agreements with Israel, everyone was like tutoing, like, seriously, how come that they're not democracies, or their human rights records, or like, and the idea was, okay, oppressors of the world are now signing these agreements. And again, turning a blind eye to the fact that, again, there's not a single democracy in the Middle East. So if people supposedly care about peace, as soon as Israel makes peace, now they care about human rights and democracy in order to claim that the peace is not valuable. So it's true that these were decisions of the leaders, but those were decisions of the leaders who rest on a broad legitimacy. One of the things that sometimes happens in the West in the discussions about democracy is that the West is under, I think, the mistaken idea that democracy is the only path to legitimate government. But there are other paths by which governments can establish themselves as legitimate in the eyes of their people. First of all, by being successful, by providing good services, by actually functioning, by being rooted in the culture. So for example, the Emirates is based on kind of traditional Arab and Bedouin culture. They have these consultative councils, even if it's not Western democracy, it's considered a legitimate form of kind of representation and having people's voices heard. So those governments are actually legitimate. They enjoy a wide range of legitimacy. And the choice that they made is a choice that was considered part and parcel of the overall vision. That's why I called it collateral benefit. It's not that like everything else is going in one direction and then normalization with Israel is going in the other direction. Normalization with Israel is part of the overall direction of these entire countries to be future looking, to focus on success. And here I have to say something. Another criticism, for example, is that, let's say the UAE is a very small country, and it's true, it's a small country, but it punches way above its weight. So for example, for the last 10 years, the UAE is the #1 country that young Arabs want to work in, and more important, want their country to emulate, about 85%. Western countries like France, Germany, the US, and Canada are a distant second with about 30%, which shows you that when young Arabs see a model of success that is genuinely Arab and Muslim, they want that. They don't want something Western. They actually want something that is from the region and shows that you can be successful as an Arab, as a Muslim in the region. Remember that ever since 9/11, the entire discourse in the Western world on Arab countries was that they're failed countries, that this is a failed region, that the only thing they can ever export is oil and terrorism. After the failure of the Arab Spring, again, the whole notion that they can never get anything right. So against this discourse of failure, you suddenly have leaders, countries that are showing success, and this is attractive, and young Arabs are noticing that, and they want their countries to be like that. Even the success of the Moroccan team now, the fact that, again, Morocco is an Abraham Accords country, again, it's true, a lot of people are still uncomfortable with that, and it's not that all the people in the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco are on board, but they understand that this is where it's going, that actually it's part of being a successful country. So let me be clear, a lot of the things are fragile. The Palestinians have made it their life's mission to try to undermine the Abraham Accords. They experienced the Abraham Accords as a betrayal, and correctly so, because if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had ever really been just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that conflict was over in April 1948. In April 1948, the Jews and the Arabs of British Mandate Palestine are pretty much done fighting, and it's very clear where the lines are. When the British leave and Israel declares independence, and 5 or 7, depends how you count, Arab armies invade, it becomes the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it gets a new life. And the support of the Arab world and the Muslim world and the mobilization of the non-aligned and the Soviet Union gave the fuel that Palestinians needed in order to keep saying no, 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 and no to Zionism, to keep their anti-Zionism for decades. Now, if the Arab world is beginning to peel away its support for Palestinian intransigence, for Palestinian anti-Zionism, of course they're experiencing it as a betrayal, and they want to do everything they can to stop that momentum. Another reason I'm disappointed with the American administration for not continuing the momentum, because they find this way they're actually aiding and abetting the side that is doing everything to stop the momentum. Now, if you want to understand, for example, the violence that broke out in May 2021, it's best understood in the context of the Abraham Accords. the desire to undermine through violence, and especially violence centered on Jerusalem. Unfortunately, for the last century, the libel of Al-Aqsa is in danger has been one of the most effective libels Palestinians had since the era of Haj Amin al-Husseini to mobilize Arab and Muslim support against Zionism. And indeed, the violence, I saw that. I have an entire Twitter feed of Abraham Accord supporters, and during the violence in 2021, many of them fell silent. So yes, we have substantial forces, Qatar, the Palestinians, Algeria, people who are trying to stop the momentum of the Abraham Accords and to continue to appeal to the Palestinian anti-Zionist vision that dominated the Arab world for so long. And we need to mobilize as many people as we can on the side of those who want to continue the momentum. But yes, there were visionary leaders. A lot of their people followed suit, but there are forces that are operating in the other direction, and nothing is secure.
Thank you. So the next question is on the UN. So how can you apply your understanding to the UN's hate fest against Israel? 15 resolutions this year against Israel and just 13 against the rest of the world. The maligning of Israel at the UN sets the tone in a long-term dangerous way for news agencies, and it gives a platform and wings to the BDS movement. So
sometimes I sadly joke that in the United Nations, the only thing that the nations are united against is Israel. I'm sure you know the history is that with the process of the decolonization and the entrance of many countries into the United Nations, the Soviet Union, with the non-aligned movement, with the Islamic world, led the process of transforming the UN really into, as described in the question, an anti-Israel hate fest. I will say a few words about the Soviet Union because seriously, they don't get enough credit for the legacy of anti-Zionism that they have given to the Western left. The Soviets are literally, I mean, they wrote the book, right? The Tsarist Russians wrote the first installment, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They literally wrote the book of anti-Semitism. The Nazis, in terms of a worldview, didn't invent much. They took pretty much the protocols as their guide. And after World War II, as I said, the Soviets, they brought down Tsarist Russia, they brought down Nazi Germany, so they're not anti-Semites. And they begin to develop this idea of anti-Zionism as the respectable, scrubbed mask for the Tsarist anti-Semitism. And if the Tsarist Russia just forged one book, the Soviet Union created an entire academic activity and world that made anti-Zionism into a respectable kind of discipline. And we don't appreciate the extent to which this was inserted into the West. All the Palestinian leadership basically got its academic degrees under that environment. Many Marxist and Western in the West were influenced and became part of those debates. Through the Western left in Europe, it ultimately made its way to the Western left in the US and Canada. Once you study it, I highly recommend the works of Isabella Toporowski, who writes beautifully about it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And they have worked methodically to introduce Israel as colonialism, Israel as racism, Israel as apartheid, Israel's genocide, Zionism is Nazism. It's all there. We have people waking up today as if they say, oh, we just realized that Israel is apartheid, as if it's something that they've researched and come to the conclusion now, not realizing that they're merely echoing something that was created decades ago. So, and through that, of course, it made it through the United Nations. Zionism is racism. Even when the Zionism is racism was repealed, the entire structure of Zionism as racism remains part of the United Nations. And I want to say something about it that is more about how the Palestinian cause operates. Because the Palestinian cause was never constructive, or if it was immediately overtaken by the destructive cause. There was never a moment, or perhaps just briefly, of Palestinians saying, we just want a state for ourselves in the land. It can be in part of the land, and we don't care if the other part is the Jewish state. From the beginning, the Palestinian cause is an anti-Zionist cause. As Bevan correctly noted, its top priority is no Jewish state. So it is marked by being a destructive cause. This is why we Westerners, when we project that the Palestinians want to end the occupation, they want to have their own state, we project our own vision, not what they're saying. They're saying very clearly, and they're acting in accordance with what they're saying, that their top priority is no Jewish state. Because their cause is destructive, it has always operated by means of hijacking. So rather than be a constructive cause that mobilizes to build a state, to build institutions of a state, to mobilize people to get a state, they're actually mobilizing through hijacking. So hijacking airplanes and hijacking causes and hijacking organizations, hijacking the United Nations Human Rights Council, hijacking Black Lives Matter, hijacking, I mean, whatever is the cause, they're very effective at hijacking it. But over time, what they do, as they do when you hijack a plane, you leave the cause an empty and destructed shell. So the UN Human Rights Council is a complete ineffective body in promoting human rights because it has been hijacked to be an obsessive body for anti-Zionism, for anti-Israel activity. The same with the United Nations. You look at the remarkable vision of its founders and the useless organization that it is today. And I would say that no small part of it is that it just became hijacked around the Palestinian destructive anti-Zionist cause. So, of course, we suffer in the process too. But I think one of the things that we need to highlight to various causes and organizations is, as I said, again, anti-Zionism, as I said, never turns out well for the Jews. But at the end of the day, I cannot look at any organization or country or political party that can show that anti-Zionism has somehow allowed it to be a better organization and serve humanity well for it.
Thank you. So moving on to the next one, is extreme right-wingers in the new Israeli coalition is causing some deep concern for many UK Zionists. How do you see this playing out in reality, and how do we respond to people who already call Israel a fascist state, etc.?
Okay, so first I'll start with my semi-joke. I always say that Italian fascism was always more Italian than it was ever fascism. Another way to tell the joke is, what's the difference between German fascism and Italian German? Is this was German and this was Italian. I don't know if you know, until the German invasion of Italy, because again, the Germans could not count on the Italian to do anything fascist seriously, so they just had to invade them. There were more Jews in Italy than they were at the beginning of the war. Jews actually fled to Italian fascist control areas because they knew they were safe there. So this is to say that at the end of the day, Jewish fascism will always be more Jewish. You know, it's a bunch of people who will argue, nothing will ever work. So this is kind of half jokingly to say, you know, the people go very, very far in kind of what they imagine. And I think we need to remember where we live. But in terms of what are the scenarios, this is a government that the scenarios are all over the place. And that's why it's a bit weird, because on the one hand, I can imagine some very positive scenarios, and I'll outline them quickly. Number one, Netanyahu. Netanyahu, amazingly, and I've never voted for him, always voted pretty much for Labor. But the thing about Netanyahu is whenever he gets elected, the left always says that this is the end of democracy, the end of Israel. He's warmongering. Every summer, there's always an op-ed that says Netanyahu is going to start a war this summer because it's going to serve him. By now, we have enough years of data to know that Netanyahu is the most risk-averse prime minister Israel has ever had. The number of Jews and Arabs killed when Netanyahu is in power is the lowest in the conflict's history. The number of Palestinians who were killed in the West Bank under this government, this outgoing government, which everyone loves, it's Jews and Arabs together, it's left, it's Yair Lapid. This has been the most lethal government for Palestinians, I think, in 2 decades. Certainly more than any time under Netanyahu. But because the image of this government is diverse and inclusive and left-wing and Yair Lapid, people are not looking at the data as much. So first, Netanyahu is known to be risk-averse and one that actually does not foment violence. Civil liberties, everything have expanded under Netanyahu. Netanyahu was the signer and promoter of the Abraham Accords. Netanyahu has declared his intention in this government to expand the Abraham Accords, hopefully, especially, he says, to Saudi. And Netanyahu knows exactly what that would mean. Netanyahu is the one that essentially, as part of the Abraham Accords, put every discussion of annexation to rest. That's it, it's off the table. So this is kind of on the positive side. Another positive scenarios is the fact that Haredis form such a substantial share of this government. And again, the Haredis are not the violent racist part here. Will that mean that they take more responsibility for Israel rather than behaving like a defensive minority that just takes for their own way of life? Remains to be seen. And then the question is Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and they're clearly the ideological right, the ideological fascist right. I read a lot of very extreme left-wing analysis. It's always interesting. Someone said, someone had a very interesting observation. He said, the Israeli ideological right is actually looking at the failure and destruction of their dreams. Annexation is off the table. Israelis want more direct flights to Dubai, more normalization. They will pay the price necessary for that. They are not enamored with the idea of annexation or settlements. It's very clear that this is not a priority of the broad Israeli public. The recent government, the fact that Jews and Arabs formed a coalition together was something that was generally acceptable. Even people in the Likud found it acceptable. They understand that actually the vast majority of Israelis are going in a direction that is exactly the opposite of the extreme right-wing vision of annexation and apartheid and settlements. And as a result, they're trying to maybe foment violence and to try to do things that will reshuffle the cards and hopefully move the Israeli public away from a direction which is moving away from the right-wing vision. So I thought it was an interesting analysis, and I think there's a lot to it. Ben Gvir, I think, represents another interesting phenomena, which is, we might like it or not, entry into Israeli society is from the right, meaning that over the decades, you can see a lot of people who were considered right-wing demons, and a lot of young people followed them. And today they are the darlings of the center, Naftali Bennett being just a more recent example, of Victor Lieberman, Tzachi Negbi, Begin, I mean, there's Sharon. A lot of young Haredi Jews are now kind of looking for their entry into Israeli society through right-wing politics, and many of them have been Ben Gvir's supporters. So these are the possible positive scenarios. The negative scenario is, of course, that Netanyahu, at the end of the day, is too weak to stop all of this, cannot promote any of his visions. The right wing is able to foment violence, shuffle the cards. Yes, this is why this government and this incoming coalition is so odd. There's a very, very wide range of possible scenarios, some very good, some very bad. And at this point, it's very difficult to say where it's going to land. So I don't have one clear answer that says, oh, don't worry or do worry. My only way to discuss it at this point is to try to seriously assess the range of scenarios and recognize that some of them look pretty grim, but some of them also look pretty good. And I have no way of knowing which way it will go.
Thank you. Next question is, what's the projected demographic picture regarding the percentage of Arabs in Israel as time goes on? I suppose also prospects for Arab Israelis as well.
Generally, for quite some time now, the ratio of Jews to Arabs within the state of Israel, but also generally, is pretty stable. So part of the growing education and all that is that Arabs have the fertility rate has come down substantially. By now, the Jewish rate, even the Jewish secular rate, is a bit higher. So them remaining about 20% of the Israeli public seems to be about stable. And it's likely to remain quite stable. Generally, Israel's Arabs are undergoing a process of Israelization. So more of Israel's Arab citizens are calling themselves Israelis, prefer to be called as Arab Israelis rather than Palestinians. Generally, if you're an Arab Israeli and you say you want to be known as a Palestinian, it's a way to say that you are anti-Zionist, that you are anti the Jewish state, and you place yourself as a citizen in opposition to the Zionism of Israel. But that's actually not the majority. The majority are identifying themselves as Israeli Arabs. I'm sure you've noticed some of Israel's top defenders today on social media and diplomacy are Arabs. And they speak to what it means to be an Arab in the state of Israel. A lot of it, again, has to do with the changes in the Arab world. The fact that Mansour Abbas actually broke with the Arab Joint List had to do with the Abraham Accords. The Arab Joint List voted against the Abraham Accords in the Israeli Knesset, right? So you kind of wrap your head around all this. So Israeli Arabs in the Israeli democracy represented are voting against the Abraham Accords because they took their cue from the Palestinians who perceived it as a betrayal. A lot of Israeli Arabs were not pleased with that. And Mansour Abbas realized that there was a market for a political Arab party that would change course and actually not be against the Jewish state, but willing to recognize it and to work with it. And this is how the current government came about. So the Abraham Accords also have an impact on Israel's Arabs, the sense that, again, you could be an Arab and support the Jewish state. You no longer have to choose. So that's having a kind of effect. So there's the general process, all in all, I think is generally positive, with more and more of Israel's Arab citizens slowly, more comfortably viewing themselves as Israelis and as an Arab minority within a Jewish state.
Thank you. I think we'll have one more question, which is, what are the prospects of gaining Zionists among countries besides those in the Middle East, so in wider regions?
Generally, the priority right now is, of course, in the Middle East, because that's where it would make the biggest difference for having peace, and for the West, where the rise of anti-Zionism, I think, presents the greatest danger to Jewish life. Because, as I said, I cannot think of a single instance in the 20th and 21st century where anti-Zionism somehow did not translate into hostility to Jewish life. So I think, for example, I'm very much in awe and supportive of the way that Britain's Jews and their allies work together to really make it clear that they're not going to have Corbyn's Labour Party and not have that anti-Zionism and kind of let it slide. American Jews now are fighting with a Democratic Party to prevent kind of its anti-Zionist wing from becoming too strong. That's the best thing Jews can do, first of all, to secure Jewish life wherever they are. So I think, first of all, battling anti-Zionism and supporting Zionism in the West and in the Middle East, those are the two highest priorities. I'll also maybe share a small anecdote. Last year, I was a visiting professor in Georgetown, and I taught a course on Zionism and anti-Zionism. And at the end of the course, one of my Jewish students came up to me and she said, "This course was more valuable to me than dozens of hours of therapy." And it actually led me to realize in many of the conversations with her and other students that anti-Zionism on campuses in the United States, maybe also in the UK, is experienced as a form of bullying. The biggest mistake we've done over the years is to think that anti-Zionism is a conversation about Israel. It's not a conversation about Israel. And much of the mistakes we've made is engaging as if it's a good faith, genuine conversation about Israel. It's not. It's a form of bullying that works by constantly moving the goalposts. And whenever Jews are willing to concede something, they immediately are asked to concede some more until you get into bizarre contortions of Jewish identity. So I think Zionism is important, first of all, in the West in order to secure Jewish life. I think it's important in the Middle East in order to bring about peace sooner rather than later. And then in the rest of the world, I must say, once you take out the West and you take out the Middle East, that are the countries that have the longest history, let's say, with the Jewish people and with Judaism, the East is a completely different place. The East I've been speaking over the years with many delegations from India and China and Japan. They have a fascination with Israel. They're interested in our story. And the more they will see that being in close relations with Israel doesn't cost them relations with the Arab and Islamic world, I think we'll see closer relations there. That's a completely different field. I mean, they don't have the historical, theological baggage. But the top priority for me, for we should all be Zionists, is the West and our region, because that's where it carries the greatest promise in securing a thriving Jewish life and in securing peace for Israel.
Okay, and thank you so much. I think we're about done, and we finished just on time. So thank you so much for your time and patience in answering everyone's questions. We will be sharing a link of this recording to those in attendance if you want to rewatch it or share it with any friends or colleagues, and hopefully they can find it valuable too. Thank you, Kira, for handling the questions so professionally. And Alan, thank you as well. I don't know if Alan, if you want to say a last word as well. Okay, we'll leave it there. But again, thanks to Alan and Fathom and Einat. That was really, really terrific. And we look forward to hosting you again in the future sometime. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Happy birthday.